hope you won't misunderstand what I'm going to say. I'm not preaching, and heaven knows I don't pretend to be better than anyone else. I'm only trying to call attention to a fact. The fact that this year, or this month, or more likely this very day, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people.
Well, this morning, CNN's Christiane Amanpour just had an exclusive one-on-one sit-down with former President Barack Obama. The two are in Athens, Greece, the birthplace of democracy, and had a very candid discussion. The war in Ukraine, the upcoming U.S. election, and how to navigate a global, very tricky relationships with autocratic leaders. Christiane will join us in a moment. But first, here's part of that conversation.
President Biden, a man who you know extremely well, has made the defense of democracy the sort of centerpiece of his administration. It just so happens that right now there's also not just, threats to democracy by dictatorships and autocrats, but also illiberal democracy as well. Yeah. He has called the president of China a dictator, and they're sticking with it. He is also hosting, as we speak, the Prime Minister of India, Modi, who is considered autocratic or at least illiberal Democrat. What is the point, I guess, or how should a president engage with those kinds of leaders, either in the naming of them or in the dealing with them?
Look, it's complicated. The president of the United States has a lot of equities. And when I was president, I would deal with figures, in some cases who were allies, who, if you pressed me in private, do they run their governments and their political parties in ways that I would say are ideally democratic? I'd have to say no.
Do you want to name names?
But no, of course not. But you had to do business with them because they're important for national security reasons. There are a range of economic interests. I dealt with China to get the Paris Accords done. I dealt with Modi to get the Paris Accords done, because I think climate change is something that transcends, any particular momentary issues. It's a problem that humanity's got to deal with over the next several decades in a serious way. I do think that it is appropriate for the President of the United States, where he or she can, to uphold those principles and to challenge, whether behind closed doors or in public, trends that are troubling. And so I'm less concerned about labels than I'm concerned about specific practices. I think it is important for the President of the United States to say that if you have Uyghurs in China who are being placed in mass camps and re-educated, quote unquote, that's a problem. That's a challenge to all of us, and we have to pay attention to it. I think it is true that if the president meets with Prime Minister Modi, then the protection of the Muslim minority in a majority Hindu India, that's something worth mentioning. Because, and by the way, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, who I know well, part of my argument would be that if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India, then there is a strong possibility India at some point starts pulling apart. And we've seen what happens when you start getting those kinds of large internal conflicts. So that would be contrary to the interests not just of Muslim India, but also Hindu India. So I think it's important to be able to talk about these things honestly. You're never going to have things are never going to be as clean as you'd like, right, because the world is complicated.
Well, the Congress is actually anxiously waiting to hear you. I'm told there are two questioners, Sabrina from the Wall Street Journal and Kumar from the Trust of India. And Sabrina, you first.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a question for the Prime Minister, but first a two-part question for you. Your comments at a fundraiser this week appear to be the first time in recent memory that a sitting U.S. president has called a Chinese leader a dictator. Did those comments about President Xi undermine or complicate the progress your administration has made in maintaining a relationship with China? And secondly, on India, as you raise these broader issues of human rights and democracy, what is your message to those, including some members of your own party, who say that your administration is overlooking the targeting of religious minorities and crackdown on dissent in Prime Minister Modi's country?
The answer to your first question is no. When we're talking to our allies and partners around the world, including India, we let the idea of my choosing and avoiding saying what I think is the facts with regard to the relationship with India, with China, is just not something I'm going to change very much. I think I believe that, and I've said this for some time, that the hysteria about the relationship with China is collapsing and moving, et cetera, et cetera. We had an incident that caused some confusion, you might say. But Secretary Blinken had a great trip to China. I expect to be meeting with President Xi sometime in the future, in the near term, and I don't think it's had any real consequence. And what was your second question?
So as you raise these broader issues of human rights and democracy, what is your message to those, including some members of your own party, who believe that your administration is overlooking the targeting of religious minorities and a crackdown on dissent in India?
Well, look, the Prime Minister and I had a good discussion about democratic values, and that's the nature of our relationship. We're straightforward with each other, and we respect each other. One of the fundamental reasons that I believe the U.S.-China relationship is not in the space it is in the U.S.-Indian relationship is that there's an overwhelming respect for each other because we're both democracies. And it's a common democratic character of both our countries and our people, our diversity, our culture, our open, tolerant, robust debate. And I believe that we believe in the dignity of every citizen. And it is in America's DNA, and I believe in India's DNA, that the whole world has a stake in our success, both of us, in maintaining our democracies, makes us appealing partners, and enables us to expand democratic institutions around the world. And I believe this, and I still believe this.
Mr. Prime Minister, India has long prided itself as the world's largest democracy, but there are many human rights groups who say that your government has discriminated against religious minorities and sought to silence its critics. As you stand here in the east room of the White House, where so many world leaders have made commitments to protecting democracy, what steps are you and your government willing to take to improve the rights of Muslims and other minorities in your country and to uphold free speech?
मुझे आश्चर्य हो रहा है कि आप कह रहे हैं कि लोग कहते हैं नहीं, भारत डेमोक्रेसी है। और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने कहा, भारत और अमेरिका दोनों के डीएनए में लोकतंत्र है। लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारी रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं और हमारे पूर्वजों ने उसको शब्दों में ढाला है संविधान के रूप में। और हमारी सरकार लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। और हमारा संविधान और हमारी सरकार, और हमने सिद्ध किया है डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर। और जब मैं डिलीवर कहता हूं तब कास्ट, क्रीड, रिलीजन, जेंडर किसी भी भेदभाव को वहां जगह नहीं होती है। और जब हम लोकतंत्र की बात करते हैं तब अगर ह्यूमन वैल्यूज नहीं है, ह्यूमैनिटी नहीं है, ह्यूमन राइट्स नहीं है, फिर तो वो डेमोक्रेसी है ही नहीं। और इसलिए जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है। और इसलिए भारत सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास, उन मूलभूत सिद्धांतों को लेकर के, और इसलिए हम चलते हैं। भारत में सरकार के जो बेनिफिट्स हैं वो एक्सेस टू ऑल है, जो भी उसके हकदार हैं उन सबको मिलते हैं। इसलिए भारत के लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों में कोई भेदभाव नहीं है, न धर्म के आधार पर, न जाति के आधार पर, न उम्र के आधार पर, न भूभाग के आधार पर।
Kumar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, sir. Sir, my question is on the issue of climate change. Both countries have spoken strongly about the need to tackle the climate change, but there is a view.
Climate change. I'm sorry.
Yeah, both countries have spoken about the challenge of climate change, but there is a view that ambitious targets are set, but implementation is found often lacking. And there is also a criticism of lack of technological transfer, financial transfer from the developed countries to the developing nations. How do you both leaders see the way ahead on this pressing issue?
Well, first of all, I think it is the existential threat to humanity, climate change. It's the most serious problem we face as human beings. We have to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've made enormous progress here in the United States on dealing with this issue by doing three things. Number one, by insisting that we move every one of our industries into a position where they can take advantage of cheaper and more extensive and more available renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind or hydrogen and green hydrogen. There's a whole range of things we've been working on. In addition to that, we find ourselves in a position that what we've done is that we have significantly reduced for example, I made a commitment that we are going to make sure that by 2030, 30% of all our land and sea and oceans were in conservation, could not be developed. We're well on our way to doing that, and that's also absorbing carbon from the air as a consequence of that, because of the conservation. We are in a position as well, but we have provided for significant increase in funding for a whole range of issues, but not just for the United States, but for the rest of the world. For example, we're working with the G7 to provide for infrastructure work for dealing with global warming on the continent of Africa. In Angola, building the largest solar project, moving ourselves, having railway to go all the way across the southern from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean in Africa, to be able to transport and do it cheaper and do it with less, how can I say it, less carbon emissions. We're trying to work with other countries to maintain their carbon sinks so they don't have to develop them like we did in causing pollution, and we're trying to figure out how to work out to pay them not to develop certain areas like the Amazon and Brazil. But there's a lot of technology that's available that we're sharing and we share with one another. We've learned how to do solar energy, which is considerably cheaper than it is for fossil fuels. The same way dealing with not just solar, but dealing with wind. And so there's a lot of technology that we've developed, and we're well on our way, I think, to meeting the commitment we made that we made in Paris. And we're prepared to share all of that with India that has a desire to do the same.
एक्सेलेंसी, आपने सही कहा। जहां तक भारत का सवाल है, एनवायरमेंट, क्लाइमेट, ये हमारे सांस्कृतिक परंपरा में अत्यंत महत्वपूर्ण स्थान है उसका। हमारे लिए एनवायरमेंट ये आर्टिकल ऑफ फेथ है। ये कन्वीनियंस के कारण करने का हमारा काम नहीं है, हम ये मानते हैं। हम एक्सप्लॉइटेशन ऑफ नेचर में विश्वास नहीं करते हैं। पूरे सृष्टि को चलाने के लिए मिल्किंग ऑफ नेचर तक तो चल सकता है, लेकिन एक्सप्लॉइटेशन ऑफ नेचर नहीं चल सकता है। हम इस पक्ष में रहे हैं और उसी के मूलभूत आधार पर भारत अपने लिए करता है, इतना ही नहीं, हम कुछ ग्लोबल इनिशिएटिव भी ले रहे हैं। आपको मालूम है, G20 देशों ने पेरिस में जो प्रॉमिस किया था, सभी G20 देशों में अकेला हिंदुस्तान है जिसने पेरिस में जो प्रॉमिस किए थे वो सारे प्रॉमिस पूरे किए हैं। इतना ही नहीं, सोलर एनर्जी के क्षेत्र में हमने ग्लासगो में रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी के क्षेत्र में 500 गीगावाट का टारगेट रखा है। हमने 2030 तक भारत की रेलवे का नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य रखा है। और भारत की रेलवे कहने के बाद आपको उसका स्केल पता होना चाहिए। भारत की रेलवे का मतलब है कि हर दिन मेरे यहाँ रेल के डिब्बे में पूरा ऑस्ट्रेलिया होता है। इतना बड़ा मेरा देश है और वहाँ मैं 2030 तक रेलवे को नेट जीरो लेकर के चल रहा हूँ। उसी प्रकार से जो हमने सोलर एनर्जी के टारगेट तय किए थे, हमने इथेनॉल के टारगेट तय किए थे 10% का, वो समय से पहले पूरा कर दिया। हम 20% इथेनॉल ब्लेंडिंग की दिशा में आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। हम ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन को इनिशिएट कर रहे हैं और भारत ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन हब बने, उस दिशा में हम काम कर रहे हैं। हमने दुनिया के लिए इंटरनेशनल सोलर अलायंस उसका हमने लॉन्च किया और आज दुनिया के कई देश उसमें भारत के साथ मिलकर के आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। हमने जो आइलैंड कंट्रीज है उनको स्पेशली सोलार के क्षेत्र में मदद करके उनको एक नया विश्वास दिया है कि हम आपकी कठिनाइयों में आपके साथ हैं। भावी किसी भी संकट के लिए हम आपकी चुनौती को पार करने के लिए हमारी जिम्मेवारियां निभाएंगे, आपको भी मदद करेंगे। हम वो देश हैं जिसने एक और नया क्षेत्र हाथ लिया है। हम देख रहे हैं कि नेचुरल कैलेमिटी के कारण आज मनुष्य मृत्यु की चर्चा तो होती है, लेकिन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का इतना नुकसान होता है जो 50-50 साल तक भरपाई नहीं हो सकता। और इसलिए ये जो क्लाइमेट चेंज के कारण जिस प्रकार का संकट आ रहा है, तो ऐसा इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बनना चाहिए जिसमें रेजिलियंस हो। और इसके लिए CDRI हमने एक ग्लोबल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को जन्म दिया है। और आपको पता होगा, मैंने ग्लासगो के अंदर एक विषय रखा है दुनिया के सामने, और जिसको पिछले दिनों UN सेक्रेटरी जनरल और मैंने उसको लॉन्च किया है, वो है मिशन लाइफ। और जब मैं लाइफ कहता हूं तब लाइफ स्टाइल फॉर एनवायरमेंट। हर इंडिविजुअल को प्रो क्लाइमेट, प्रो एनवायरमेंट अपना जीवन जीने का तरीका डेवलप करना होगा। इतने बड़े संकट के लिए उस दिशा में भी हम काम कर रहे हैं। और मुझे विश्वास है कि भारत ने जो आज इन क्षेत्रों में काम शुरू किया है, इसलिए नहीं कि भारत ने दुनिया के एनवायरनमेंट को बुरा किया है, लेकिन हम इसलिए कर रहे हैं कि हमारी भावी पीढ़ी की हमें चिंता है। हम हमारी भावी पीढ़ी को ऐसा विश्व नहीं दे सकते हैं कि जिसके लिए उसके लिए जीना कठिन हो जाए। और इसलिए एक ग्लोबल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी के रूप में भारत ने खुद ने कुछ बुरा नहीं किया है तो भी अच्छा करने में, योगदान देने में हम अग्रिम भूमिका निभा रहे हैं और हम आगे भी निभा रहेंगे। जहां तक समृद्ध देश हैं, लगातार चर्चा रही है, टेक्नोलॉजी ट्रांसफर हो, फाइनेंशियल मदद हो, और धीरे धीरे विश्व भी मन बना रहा है कि जो देश इसमें करना चाहते हैं उनको टेक्नोलॉजी की मदद मिले, उनको फाइनेंशियल मदद मिले। हम प्रतीक्षा कर रहे हैं कि जितना जल्दी इस विषय में आगे बढ़ेंगे, दुनिया को इस संकट से हम जल्दी से मुक्त कर पाएंगे। धन्यवाद।
Let me add one thing to that. We have caused damage in the United States the way we developed over the last 300 years. And that's why I was able to convince my colleagues in the Congress to pass legislation, the largest climate fund ever in American and the world history, $369 billion. $369 billion to deal with the climate crisis. And we're doing it extensively now, and I think you're going to see significant progress. Thank you all very, very much.
भाई साहब वही काम हो गए जिसके हमको डर लग रहे थे। हमरे शेर के संग देखे कितना भाई साहब खतरनाक काम हुए। नहीं 2002 वो का नहीं, वो तो सब सेटल हो गए, उसका डर नहीं है भाई साहब। ऐसा चीज जिसके भाई साहब रात को सपने में भी डर दिख रहे होते हैं, रात में ऐसे दिख रहे हैं। प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस हो गए भाई साहब, प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस हमरे शेर के संग। जिस चीज से भाई साहब 9 साल से बचा बचा फिर रहा था हमारा शेर, वही चीज हो गए। और जिस बात के हमको डर थे ना भाई साहब, विदेश में ही होंगे कहीं, अपने देश में तो होने का मतलब ही नहीं है, सवाल ही नहीं है। अपने देश में तो हो ही नहीं सकते। एक बार हुए थे खाली, वो भी दुनिया के सबसे अनूठे प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस हो गए थे, जिसमें प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस का जवाब देने वाला आदमी जो पूरे टाइम जो ऐसे करता रहा, एक भी सवाल का जवाब नहीं दिए। हुए थे इंडिया में भी, अपने यहाँ भी, वो तो अपना कर दिया काम। पर भाई साहब अमेरिका में हो गए, अमेरिका में ऐसा प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस हो गए भाई साहब, ऐसा सवाल पूछ ले, ऐसा सवाल हमको हंसी भी आ रहे हैं अब तक। देखो
लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारी रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं। भारत के लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों में कोई भेदभाव नहीं है, न धर्म के आधार पर, न जाति के आधार पर, न उम्र के आधार पर, न भूभाग के आधार पर।
क्या समझ रहा है लोग? हम अपने शेर के इस बात पे नहीं हंस रहे कि भारत में धर्म के आधार पे, जाति के आधार पे, क्षेत्र के आधार पे कोई भेदभाव नहीं होता। हम इस बात पे नहीं हंस रहे। हम तो ये रिपोर्टर, जो लेडी रिपोर्टर जो सवाल पूछे थे, उस पे हंसी छुट रहे हैं। इस पे काहे को छुटेंगे हमरा? लेडी रिपोर्टर के कैसा सवाल पूछे ना, तो ये पूछे टॉनिक कौन सा लेते हो कि नहीं लेते हो, आम काट के खाते हो, चूस के खाते हो, बटवा रखते हो कि नहीं रखते हो। ऐसा कोई भी सवाल नहीं पूछे जरूरी। माइनॉरिटी के सवाल पूछे कि माइनॉरिटी पे खतरा हो रहे हैं, वो लोकतंत्र पे भारत में खतरा हो रहे हैं, मानवाधिकार पे खतरा हो रहे हैं, ऐसा ऐसा सवाल। वो तो भाई साहब हमरा शेर, भाई साहब वो तो हम लोग, हमरा जो पार्टी है वो पहले ही भाई साहब फिक्स कर दिए, 2 सवाल से ज्यादा नहीं होने चाहिए, 2 ही सवाल। एक इंडिया का रिपोर्टर पूछेगा कोई, और एक अमेरिका का रिपोर्टर। इंडिया वाले के तो कोई डर ही नहीं थे, कहा पूछेंगे मोदी जी आप इतने महान कैसे हो, ज्यादा ही पूछ लेगा। या मोदी जी आप वो जहाज में कितने दिन तक कैसे रहे, कहा खाए हो, आज कौन सा व्रत रखे हो, ऐसा ही पूछते। डर लग रहे थे अमेरिका वाले के, पता नहीं कहा पूछ लें, और भाई साहब डर सही निकल गए। ऐसा पूछे, एक ही सवाल पूछे, एक ही सवाल में पानी पिला दिया भाई साहब। सोचो 8-10 सवाल पूछ लेते वहां अमेरिका में, तो भाई साहब हमारा शेर तो बोलता भाई साहब, ऐसा बोलता, कह देना अपने राष्ट्रपति को जान बचा के वापस होटल लौट आया हम। ऐसा ही बोलने पड़ते जैसा ही सवाल माइनॉरिटी का। इस बात पे गुस्सा आ रहे हैं।
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed a joint session of Congress Thursday, shortly after being welcomed to the White House by President Biden as part of a state visit. Human rights groups have accused Modi of discriminating against his country's Muslim population and silencing dissent. Modi, who has also overseen a crackdown on the free press, made the rare concession of answering unscripted questions from reporters at the White House. Both he and Mr. Biden sidestepped questions about humanitarian concerns in India and instead focused on their nation's economic partnership.
And with this visit, we're demonstrating once more how India and the United States are collaborating on nearly every human endeavor and delivering progress across the board.
CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes has more on Modi's stay in Washington.
नमस्कार.
He's been accused of dismantling democracy in India. And yet, Washington rolled out the red carpet today for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Tonight, he'll be treated to a rare state dinner, a sign of how crucial his friendship is as the U.S. competes with India's neighbor, China.
We're straightforward with each other, and we respect each other.
Under Modi's leadership, India's government has undermined elections, press freedom, the judicial system, and the rights of the country's Muslim minority.
Democracy runs in our veins.
For one of the first times ever today, Modi had to face a group of reporters and take a question about that.
There are many human rights groups who say that your government has discriminated against religious minorities and sought to silence its critics.
He denied all of it.
Democratic values, there is absolutely no discrimination, neither on basis of caste, creed, or age.
President Biden took questions too, defending his decision this week to describe China's president, Xi Jinping, as a dictator. China called his comments absurd and irresponsible.
Saying what I think is the facts with regard to the relationship with India, with China, is just not something I'm going to change very much.
लोकतंत्र तो है ही अपने है कौन नहीं है हाँ? लोकतंत्र कितने चलो हुआ है मोदी जी तो लोकतंत्र के पहरेदार हैं अब इनमें गोली भी तो है जी अमेरिका में आओ गोली तो है नहीं बहुत बहुत ज्यादा मोदी जी ने बोली कि भारत में लोकतंत्र हर हाल में है और डीएनए में है भारत है ही वही तो हम कह रहे हैं ये और बात है कि मोदी जी कपड़ा देख के पहचान लेते हैं कौन का है अब ये और बात होती है अब काऊ काऊ के घर पे बुलडोजर चल रहे हैं जी अलग बात है मगर लोकतंत्र है ना लोकतंत्र तो है अरे जिज्जी पद्मा चुनी भई सरकार अगर गिरा दी जाए तो का जगह लोकतंत्र नहीं है अरे जिज्जी पत्रकार जेल में बेड़ दे जा रहे तो का लोकतंत्र नहीं है अब का सबको छू बुलंद है अरे मतलब जी हम जी कह रहे अमेरिका में 2 क्वेश्चन पूछे भी इनसे और दोनों में से एक में लोकतंत्र की बात कर रहे मानवाधिकार को हनन लोकतंत्र खत्म हो रहा है मतलब वहाँ पे हमें नहीं लगा तो अच्छे पत्रकार ही नहीं है जी अपने कह के है पत्रकार इन्हें सबको कहीं नहीं लेगा जी पूछते वहाँ इतने अच्छे क्वेश्चन करते अब प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस तो अपने मोदी जी नहीं कर रहे थे पर क्वेश्चन तो भी बहुत अच्छे इंटरव्यू अक्षय कुमार तक को इंटरव्यू दे दो क्वेश्चन थे आप आम चूस के खाते हैं कि काट के खाते हैं पद्मान जो कह रहे जब आम को सीजन चल रहा है तो आम पे सवाल करो जो लोकतंत्र पे काय को पूछने हैं सवाल लोकतंत्र को सीजन जब चला ही नहीं रहा हो खत्म हुआ है तो लोकतंत्र पे काय कर रहे हो फालतू के चाहे हमें तो बहुत लेकिन जिज्जी वहां तो दिल बैठो जा रहा सब एक ना ही हो जाए अरे तुम चिंता नहीं करो अरे भाषण में तो है ना अबे लोकतंत्र भाषण में तुम सुनत रही हो लोकतंत्र है और बस वही पे खुश हो लो दिल कमजोर देखो हमाओ भी नहीं करो तुम ऐसे बात नहीं करो घबरा रहा है चिंता नहीं करो
The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi wraps up his state visit to Washington today. After hosting the Indian leader at a private dinner on Wednesday, President Biden and the White House rolled out the red carpet yesterday for the head of what is sometimes called the world's largest democracy. Biden and Modi then sat down in the Oval Office where the two discussed democratic values. Modi praised the president for calling a speech Biden gave as vice president 8 years ago, in which Biden said, quote, "Our goal is to become India's best friend." Modi said it was that commitment by Biden that inspired India to take bold and ambitious initiatives in their relationship. In a surprising moment during a joint press conference, Prime Minister Modi took 2 questions. Since becoming India's leader in 2014, Modi has never held a solo press conference. He was asked what steps he's willing to take to improve the rights of religious minorities in his country and uphold free speech. Modi denied any form of discrimination and said India's foundational principles are made up of the democratic values instilled in its constitution.
आखिर वो सवाल उन 2 सवालों में आ ही गया जिस सवाल से प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी पिछले 9 साल से बच रहे थे, जिस सवाल से बचने के लिए भारत में और दुनिया भर में प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस नहीं कर रहे थे। यह वो सवाल था जिसका सामना अकेले प्रधानमंत्री मोदी कर रहे थे, मगर जिसे पैदा किया है खुद उन्होंने, उनके राजनीतिक सहयोगियों ने, आरएसएस ने, गोदी मीडिया ने, इन सभी के समर्थन से बेलगाम हो चुके धर्म गुरुओं ने, जो जंतर मंतर से लेकर हरिद्वार तक मुसलमानों के नरसंहार के नारे लगा रहे थे, जो किसी को गौ रक्षा के नाम पर घेर कर मार दे रहे थे और पुलिस कार्रवाई ना करे इसलिए महापंचायतें कर रहे थे। मोदी सरकार और बीजेपी की सरकारें इनके खिलाफ कार्रवाई नहीं कर रही थीं। आज इन सभी की मेहनत का नतीजा यह निकला है कि दुनिया के मंच पर इस महान और शानदार देश के प्रधानमंत्री को शर्मसार होना पड़ा है। यही वो सवाल था जिसे भारत और दुनिया भर के पत्रकार, लोकतंत्र के समर्थक, राजनीतिक चिंतक प्रधानमंत्री मोदी से पूछना चाहते थे। यही वो सवाल है जिसने उनकी अमेरिका यात्रा की चमक को मिट्टी में मिला दिया। राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन की पत्नी को तोहफे में हीरा देकर अपने लिए जीरा हासिल नहीं कर सके, बल्कि इस सवाल ने उनकी यात्रा को जीरो कर दिया है। जब यह सवाल पूछा जा रहा था तब प्रधानमंत्री का हाव भाव, उनका चेहरा बता रहा था कि उन पर यह सवाल कितना भारी पड़ रहा है। इस सवाल के सामने भारत के प्रधानमंत्री की 20 साल की राजनीति उस छात्र की तरह हाथ बांधकर, चेहरा लटका कर खड़ी थी जिसे नकल करते हुए मास्टर जी ने पकड़ लिया हो। प्रधानमंत्री ने जवाब में कुछ कहा, मगर वो जवाब नहीं, निश्चित रूप से उस सवाल का जवाब तो बिल्कुल नहीं। सुप्रीम कोर्ट से लेकर हाई कोर्ट के तमाम जजों ने चेतावनियां दी, नफरत की भाषा पर लगाम लगाने को कहा, मगर सरकार चुप रही, क्योंकि इससे राजनीतिक तापमान चढ़ता है, वोट मिलता है।
As a bet. Is it a bet?
Well, what appears to have been the case is both the US and India appears to have learned lessons from this. India, of course, has not condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the Biden administration is keen to get India on camp. Now, if you ask Indian diplomats and experts, why does India still cleave to Russia? They typically say that India, when it makes these defense deals, wants a technology transfer and wants manufacturing in India. And the US typically has offered off-the-shelf arms sales. So it appears that Washington has got that lesson, that there is a technology transfer and manufacturing with this deal. On the other hand, this deal involves Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which is a state-owned company, and not like what we saw with the French Rafales, which had some of these business leaders with close ties to New Delhi, Ambanis, Adanis. They don't have any, say. They don't really have the expertise of building this. So on both sides, lessons have been learned. But with the Tejas fighter jets, these are very long projects. The Tejas, the rollout was supposed to be early November, then 2022, then it moved to 2023, and now it's 2024, and they're having problems getting funding for it. So these are very long-term projects, but it's definitely showing a shift in that alliance.
Earlier, again, on the South Lawn, it was also Joe Biden who spoke. A lot of the diaspora in the United States is pro-Modi, but not all. And he gave passing nod to concerns over religious freedoms and human rights.
Equity under the law, freedom of expression, religious pluralism, and diversity of our people. These core principles have endured and evolved even as they have faced challenges throughout each of our nation's histories, and will fuel our strength, depth, and future.
So, Suketu Mehta, the language chosen there by Joe Biden versus that memorandum of understanding on fighter jet engines, what's the message Washington is sending to Delhi?
Well, the message that's being sent with all these deals is that the US-India relationship isn't based on a mutual interest in democracy and the protection of human rights and freedom of expression. It's a transactional relationship based on selling things. And it's deeply alarming. Indian democracy has never been under greater threat. And I know that there are people in the Biden administration, including Biden himself, because I've spoken with them, who are feeling enormous concern about what's happening in India right now. But they can't express it openly because they need India's support to combat the rise of China. And they're hoping that India will come around to the American viewpoint vis-a-vis Ukraine.
When it comes to the press freedom, for example, because that is intrinsic part of the democracy, of course, when you look at the latest rankings that have come out, would you believe that India is ranked at 161 in the world in press ranking? Afghanistan is ranked at 152. So that actually gives you a lot of doubt about how these press rankings are also worked out.
Suketu Mehta, you're a journalist.
I absolutely am. And with all due respect, the people who compile these rankings, they aren't just making these numbers up. India has slid enormously in press rankings. There's basically no independent television networks left that do not toe the government line. So it's not as if there are government censors which go and censor pieces of news. And yes, there are elections, but the government's been incredibly effective in using the taxation authorities, the enforcement directorate, and the manipulation of financial oligarchs to control the press. So it's not so much a Soviet model as it is a Polish or Hungarian model. The press in India, and I've been working as a journalist in India and America for many decades now, has never been in greater peril. And this is an orchestrated campaign by the party that's ruling the country. So this is Reporters Without Borders. There's a number of internationally recognized organizations that have given these really lamentable rankings to India for press freedom. It's not just the press. The greatest peril is Indian Muslims. There's over 200 million Indian Muslims. And they're systematically being told by the government, this is not your country. This is a Hindu country. This is what the stakes are. We've got to be clear what the stakes are. The BJP and the RSS, which is this non-political paramilitary organization organized along fascist lines that created the BJP, they are clear about their intentions to turn India into a Hindu nationalist state where everyone else lives by Hindu sufferance, including 200 million Indians. What do you think that's going to do? If 200 million Indians are alienated, you'll have a civil war which will make partition seem like a schoolyard brawl.
Because I think we're going to be interrupted soon by the leaders of the United States and India from the White House. On the whole citizenship law, how much is that going to be coming up in conversation during this state visit?
I don't think at all. I mean, this is a transactional relationship dressed up to be about other things, but I think Mr. Biden has been steadfast in resisting calls to even comment on India's human rights record and democracy. The goal over here is to make sure that every part of this is well scripted and on a single message, which is that the United States and India are going to work with each other in many different dimensions, from technology to trade to defense. China won't come up explicitly, but China is the matchmaker that has arranged this marriage, if you would, and both sides are going to play to their script. And so to expect anything else, I think, would be naive. And frankly, at the end of the day, this is a state visit. This is not the time for that. The die was cast when the invitation for the state visit was made. It was a decision made at the highest level of the American government and implemented by every part of the bureaucracy, that we're not going to talk about the awkward stuff. We're not going to talk about the difficult stuff. And I would argue, frankly, because America doesn't really care about any of that stuff genuinely, it's unfortunate that we end up having to sacrifice democracy and human rights and all of those other values as sort of just byproducts of the relationship. I would much rather that both countries just be much more matter of fact and say, this is important strategically. We'd love to sell you very expensive weapons. We'd like to buy your expensive weapons. And we don't have to keep couching it in the language of democracy, because that does damage to those concepts in ways that undermine, for the global South, the credibility of our commitments to those values. And there's something really lost when that dies.
So Kedamete, you agree, don't talk too much about democracy. Instead, over the long run, that diaspora will be a force for good for both countries, is what we're hearing effectively.
Well, not necessarily, because the diaspora, like India, is also split. There's a section of the diaspora that thinks of Modi as the Gujarati Elvis. They're just besotted with him. And then there's another section of the diaspora, like myself, and especially among younger Indian Americans, who are appalled at what's going on in India and are actively, they're almost like dissidents. I have friends of mine who are journalists who are not allowed to re-enter the country that they were raised in because the government has revoked their overseas citizen of India status. So the diaspora can be a force for good, but right now there's a huge struggle over narrative and about India globally and in the diaspora. Is India a democracy or not? Is India a nation for all its citizens, or is India ultimately that sad thing, a Hindu nationalist state?
There is as well, though, those who say, look, we're not that interested in politics. What we see is that in the past, there was a lot of red tape in India, and we want to see less red tape when we're dealing with U.S.-India ties.
So I'm no supporter of the Congress Party, and when they say red tape, they mean socialism. And Modi has had an interesting sort of nativist Indian socialism. There's a huge amount of support for oligarchs, like there's two in particular, Ambani and Adani. And there's an enormous amount of rent-seeking going on in Indian politics, and state support like the licenses to run favored ports and infrastructure.
Suketu Mehta, we're just going to cross over to the White House now and listen to India's Prime Minister and the U.S. President.
David Curry is president and CEO of Global Christian Relief. He also serves on the U.S. State Department's Commission on International Religious Freedom. And he joins us now with more on what's happening in the state of Manipur, India. David, who's behind these attacks on Christians and their churches?
Well, there's some ethnic tensions in Manipur, which is in the northeast. It's a state in the northeast of India. But the attacks have really been driven. It's been an escalation by, I think, the central government, the BJP party, which has made being a Christian something that's not considered part of India. It seems as though their message is, if you're not a Hindu, you're not a real Indian. And this has allowed this escalation of violence against Christians and Christian churches. We have dozens of Christian churches that have been destroyed since May 3rd, when these riots began. And you have hundreds and thousands of people, I think we're almost up to 9,000 right now, who have been displaced, Christians who have been displaced because of this violence. Regardless of how they frame it, whether it's ethnic violence or anarchist, it seems to always be that the Indian government is overlooking and even in some cases encouraging violence against Christians in India.
Now, as you said, David, many Christians are displaced. More than 30 churches have been burned. How are they surviving right now?
Well, right now they're in shelters. Got some more video feeds. There's people shoulder to shoulder sleeping in shelters, makeshift shelters in some cases. So they're literally just on the run. And this happened just a few months ago in November, December, January in Chhattisgarh, a totally different area. That's why I say that we have to look at the pattern of behavior. In both cases, especially right now in Manipur, we have video evidence that shows the police assisting the rioters in attacking the churches. This is why you have to look at what they do, not what they say.
Hello to you all from New York.
Hindutva, that is Hindu extremism, is here in the United States. Hindutva, that is Hindu extremism in India, is being fed here in the United States. I am the executive director of Hindus for Human Rights. As a progressive Hindu organization, we know this acutely. There are hardly any Hindu spaces, social, family, temple, political, where our progressive Hindu perspective isn't seen as anti-Hindu. The most explicit proof is that a bulldozer with photos of Narendra Modi and Yogi Adityanath were part of an India Day parade in Edison, New Jersey. And Sambit Patra, a BJP official, was the grand marshal of the parade. Our own board member was there on the day, and he fought with organizers about this explicit display of Islamophobic hate. And then he joined others in a town hall meeting with the mayor of Edison, Sam Joshi, who's a Hindu American.
An apology today from the Indian Business Association. A bulldozer carrying images of prominent leaders of India was included in the India Independence Day parade in Edison. Now, the use of the bulldozer was seen by many as a symbolic attack on Muslims. Advocacy groups have accused the Indian government of so-called bulldozer justice, illegal demolitions of largely Muslim-owned property. The Indian Business Administration organized the Edison parade. The letter to the mayors of Edison and Woodbridge reads in part, "Our parade should never be about politics and should never include blatant, divisive symbols. Our parade should recognize us as South Asians living in two of the best towns in the state of New Jersey." Now, the New Jersey chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations acknowledges the apology. They say the parade should celebrate India's independence and rich culture and diversity.